the Executive Director of the Army Heritage Center Foundation. And today we're pleased to have Marty Andresen here to talk about genealogy with a focus on the use of military records. Marty has been a long-time instructor in this field and has extensive experience, having served many years both as an active duty officer on the staff of the Military History Institute and as a volunteer at both the Military History Institute and the U.S. Army Heritage Education Center. I would ask that you submit your question using the question and answer icon at the bottom of your screen. Those questions will be recorded. If Marty doesn't have time during the webinar to answer them, we'll be able to provide you a response later on. And I would ask that I'll ask that you hold questions. Well, you can submit questions anytime, but that the questions will be answered at the end of Marty's presentation. So at this time, Marty, I turn over the microphone and the camera to you.
Good afternoon, folks. First, a warning. I'm absolutely technology challenged. Thus, for me, this webinar is like a magic show. Fortunately, we have 6 grandkids that are all with their cell phones and other things. So when we wanted to watch movies from Redbox, we got the necessary player, but you can't just plug it in. It has to be wired to the television. Fortunately, the grandkids, the 6-year-old, knew how to do that and very quickly did it. I do have a track phone, which embarrasses the grandkids no end. I leave it in my car. It is programmed so I can call AAA. That's the only reason I have it, is to call AAA when there's a problem. Now I use it to pick up prescriptions at Dunham Army Clinic because you can't go into the facility courtesy of the pandemic. You have to phone in and they bring your prescriptions out. So with this warning in terms of technology, let's get started. First, don't be overly concerned about taking detailed notes, as a copy of this 8-page outline being used today will be available via email from the Army Foundation. Likewise, as Mike mentioned, please hold your questions for the end. If tonight at supper or tomorrow morning at breakfast a burning question emerges, just email it into the foundation. They'll forward it on to me. Why you would be thinking about genealogy at supper or at breakfast is beyond me, but some do. Please remember when developing your questions, I teach genealogy, I don't do genealogy. That's the thrill that you get to experience. Some additional words of caution. Genealogy is much like eating chocolate, or in my case, popcorn. Once you start, you can't easily stop. Second, interaction with librarians and others may not always be good. Genealogists can be very time-consuming and can very often get demanding, if not downright pushy. Genealogists are often viewed by organizations, libraries, research facilities, etc., as pains in the tush. Don't just drop a name and ask for everything available on that individual, which is often the case. Always try to find someone on the staff who is interested in genealogy. They are probably best able to help you and direct you to the appropriate sources. You may find the same thing to be true with family members. One, many of them don't care about the family tree, and 2, they're fearful that if they answer one question, they'll be inundated with 50 other questions. Many libraries, such as Carlisle's Bosler Library, have private areas set up specifically for those doing genealogy research, which are great opportunities. Thirdly, always document what you find, either in a spiral notebook, or if you're so inclined, you can spend 20 or 30 bucks and get specially designed genealogy notebooks. There's nothing worse, particularly as a historian not dealing with genealogy, to have this key bit of information that you want to use in a publication, only to realize that you have no idea where it came from. There are many a times that when Mike was director of MHI and I was a volunteer, he would get calls from researchers saying, I'm pretty sure I picked up this tidbit at your facility. Could you please look? Well, for example, if it involves Gettysburg, you got 9 linear feet of books on Gettysburg. Good luck finding the information that was used in the publication. Lastly, unless you have really deep pockets, your quest for information in genealogy and family history can get very expensive, what with trips, lodgings, meals, photocopy fees, membership fees, etc. This is especially true if your research goes into accessing records in Europe. While we may have 200 or 300 years worth of ancestral data, in Europe, they are thinking in terms of thousands. You can't, in most cases, get in to actually work with the records. You have to pay one of the staff members to do it, and it's not cheap. Some of the major sources of information, a quick rundown. The National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, 2 facilities located in Washington, D.C. and Maryland. The National Archives and Records Administration is an independent agency of the federal government charged with the preservation and documentation of government and historical records. It also is tasked with making that information available to the public. A second major facility is the National Personnel Records Center out at St. Louis, Missouri. Since the early 20th century, the National Personnel Records Center has been the repository for millions of military personnel, health, and medical records of both discharged veterans and deceased veterans of all services. Commercially, Ancestry.com is a major facility. They're advertised on TV, and you can, through them, access some 8 billion records. There is an annual fee, and it varies based upon how much of their record collection do you wish to access. I would encourage you to wait for one of the free trial bases. Save up your questions so that when it does go as a trial basis, you can immediately access it with those records. If you do want to buy a membership, please keep in mind that on Black Friday, traditionally, Ancestry has offered full membership at roughly 1/2 of the initial asking price. The National Institute for Genealogical Studies, they offer a variety of online courses, and it will award certificates for taking those courses. The Family Tree Magazine, just Google Family Tree Magazine and you will be able to determine the content and price for the monthly subscription. There is a comprehensive records checklist in a PDF format available from the Army Heritage Center Foundation. Just email the foundation and it will be forwarded to you. Family Search. Family Search is linked with the Church of the Latter-day Saints, Mormons, and the largest library known to exist for genealogical sources. Located in Salt Lake City, Utah, the library holds genealogical records from over 110 countries, territories, and possessions. Its collection includes access to more than 2.4 million rolls of microfilm. That'll glaze you over in a heartbeat. 727,000 microfiche, over 350,000 books, serials, and other formats. And perhaps most importantly, it provides electronic access through subscriptions to the major genealogical websites. Equally important, the library offers, for a fee of course, research assistance to help you trace your family history. Many of these records are available through the family history centers, the focus of which is to help guests make personal family discoveries. Carlisle does have one of these family history centers. It's physically located in Mechanicsburg, but if you Google Carlisle, Pennsylvania Family History Center, its website will come up. The State Library of Philadelphia in Harrisburg contains a great deal of genealogical information for those coming out of Pennsylvania. Also, for the Revolutionary War, don't forget the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, and its organizational counterpart, the Sons of the American Revolution, or SAR, located in Lexington, Kentucky. Both of them have rather substantial libraries focused on genealogical research. Now, getting started on your genealogical quest, basic tools of the trade. Start off by documenting what you already know. Oftentimes, you're able to go back at least 3 generations, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. Always include state, county, city, and dates where you have them. Check around. Every family seems to have a family historian, somebody who has interest in the family tree and may have already done a great deal of genealogical research. On my wife's side, there are 2 competing, if you will. That makes it exciting around Thanksgiving time. Both have published in 3-ring binders the family trees going back several generations. It's always interesting, particularly when you discover different spellings on names and different dates for death or marriage, which one is accurate. Don't necessarily question the family historian. You may not like the answer you get. Now, there are some perceived differences between Southern families and Northern families, particularly after the Civil War. Southern families tended to remain where they were located in the family estate, whatever, and maintain the family records, the family Bible, letters, diaries, etc. Northern families tended to get rid of all that stuff because they were moving west for better opportunities, and they could either carry a whole bunch of documents or they could carry food in their Conestoga wagon. Family Bibles are particularly helpful, often document births, marriages, dates of death. This is particularly true for Bibles coming out of Europe. Telephone books and city directories. City directories started to appear in the early 1900s and were primarily geared for salesmen, merchants, and others interested in contacting residents in a particular locale. Usually they're arranged alphabetically, giving lists of names and addresses, and may also provide occupations. Pennsylvania does have a significant holding of city directories available in Harrisburg at the State Library of Pennsylvania. Although very useful, they are very difficult to find. Family lawyers and probate records, local court records, both civil and criminal. Be aware that courthouses have now caught on to the fact that genealogical research can be a real moneymaker for the county. Let's divert for a moment to discuss DD 214s, honorable discharge documents from military service. Besides being very useful at Applebee's on Memorial Day, where veterans get a free meal, a DD 214 can help with the VA and others when planning funerals for a deceased veteran. Upon retirement, I was encouraged by Carlisle Barracks to deposit a copy of my DD 214 in the local courthouse so that funeral homes and relatives could have immediate access to prove honorable service. Unfortunately, because of scams, the fact that the DD 214 reflected Social Security numbers and the mounting sunshine laws at various states, I was subsequently encouraged to retrieve my DD 214 from the courthouse. Let me assure you, retrieving a document from a local courthouse is much harder to accomplish than was depositing it in the first place. Many families, you can find letters, cards, and V-mail from World War II veterans. These can be very useful in finding out names, addresses, etc. Local school records, local newspapers, particularly what newspapers call their morgue, where they keep copies of all of their previously published newspapers. Fortunately, newspapers.com, which includes a membership fee, has indexed some 17,000 newspapers to include the Sentinel and several other now defunct Carlisle newspapers. These can be very useful for determining engagement, wedding announcements, sports coverage, and obituaries. For any of you that have seen it, the new TV program, Genetic Detective, focuses on the use of DNA to assist law enforcement. And she has found obituaries to be very useful, particularly in families that have stepchildren. Family photographs. Again, oftentimes family photographs will include a large number of individuals you have no idea who they are. At your next family reunion or Thanksgiving dinner, lay the photos out and ask other family members, do you recognize any of these individuals? You'd be amazed at the number of cousins that surfaced, several times removed perhaps. Cemeteries and cemetery records, particularly finding cemetery headstones that will have names, date of birth, date of death, oftentimes will differ from what you may already have discovered. County historical societies can be very useful and may contain published and manuscript sources previously deposited by family members. At AHEC, the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, we have what's known as the Cox Collection. It involves microfiche of some 3,000 state, county, and local histories. Now, most of these were written in the late 19th century by the offspring of railroad and mining magnates. The families were extremely wealthy, but the kids had nothing to do, so they decided to engage in writing state and local histories. Oftentimes, these histories will include rosters of residents who served in the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, etc. There is what's known as a 300-page shelf list, which identifies all of the, organized by state, identifies all of the various state histories included and available in microfiche. State libraries and archives, virtually every state has them. They contain a great deal of useful information and are worthwhile to research. Land records and land deeds. Oftentimes you will discover that in your research you find that somebody used to be living at such and such address or on such and such farm. Through land deeds you can find out what happened to those individuals. Census records. Census records for 1940 are now available online. Generally, the census records operate on a 72-year rule, feeling that anybody after 72 years is probably one, no longer living, or two, no longer concerned about their name appearing online with the census record. Immigration and naturalization records. Again, these can be very useful, particularly in my case, where ancestors came from Germany at the turn of the century. Now, as you're going through all of these, some will be useful, some will be less useful. All require a great deal of time and interaction with people. You may find certain individual names where there is suddenly a gap. They appeared in several places, and then there's a gap. If you cross-check the gap, you may discover that they correlate to one of the United States' various wars, which probably indicates that the individual male was off on military service starting in World War II. The same could be true for females who served. Now, military personnel records are generally open to the public 62 years after an individual leaves the military or is deceased. Records of any veteran who separated from the military 62 years or more can be accessed by anybody and theoretically are stored at the National Personnel Records Center, as we discussed, out at St. Louis. Now, if the individual left the service less than 62 years ago, then you have a problem. The only individual that can access those records must be next of kin and must be the senior next of kin. It can be a spouse. If the spouse is dead, it would be the oldest child, and so on and so forth. I have experienced cases where, for whatever reason, the oldest child did not wish to honor a request from one of the younger siblings to access dad or granddad's service records. Makes for an interesting conversation around the Thanksgiving table. Again, if the individual left the service over 62 years ago, this would be today, 1958, then any individual can access those records, but it must be done in writing. Again, check the website for the National Personnel Records Center. It will lay out in great detail about the standard Form 180 that must be filled out and submitted via mail, not electronically. Other places where you can find information is the Veterans Administration, mostly medical, which you will not have access to, but there are other cases where some of the basic information, branch of service, date entered, date exited, and whatnot. By and large, service records at NARA and the National Personnel Records Center are broken out by individual war. At the Revolutionary War, these are retained at the colonial state level. Remember, there was no federal government for some time after the end of the Revolutionary War. However, every state does have the tag or the adjutant general. That's a good place to start if you're trying to access Revolutionary War records. The War of 1812 involved the burning of Washington, and a lot of records were lost. And yes, some of you are thinking that the federal government, which once created, did spend a great deal of time and energy and money trying to collect Revolutionary War records from private sources. That is true. Virtually all of it burned during the War of 1812. The Mexican War was a very short war, and so finding information with regard to that is difficult at best. Civil War. Civil War is entirely different. There are vast amounts of information available, oftentimes conflicting information, which makes it exciting for the genealogist, family historian. One place to start is with the Civil War soldier and sailor system. This is a publicly available website that is providing basic information on every soldier that served either North or South during the Civil War. Unfortunately, the vast majority of records were entered into the system by volunteers. And so you have the typical typos, spelling errors. For example, no one believes my name is Andresen. They inevitably want to make it Erson, which will not show up with the names that you're looking for. You also have the problem if you happen to have a rather common last name, such as John Smith. Trying to sort out which John Smith out of the hundreds that will show up on this website becomes problematic. One thing that can help, AHEC does have a copy of every known published regimental unit history, either in hard copy or in microfiche, microfilm. Many of the states have published composite listings. For example, for Pennsylvania, it's known as the Bates Collection, which is a 5-volume work that provides a brief regimental history of when the regiment was mustered, where it served and whatnot, and then provides a comprehensive muster roster of everybody that served in that. Spanish-American War, this was a relatively short war, not, however, for the Philippine insurrection that went on forever. World War I, keep in mind that there are 3 components that served in World War I. There's the regular army, the National Guard, such as the 28th Bloody Bucket from Pennsylvania, the 29th from Maryland. And then there was the third component, the National Army, which consisted primarily of draftees. All were rolled into what became known as the Army Expeditionary Force. World War II involves selective service, draft records, and a tremendous number of unit histories. Let me say that if you are getting into unit histories, or actually any of the various sources we've talked about, Google and check online. Every day, more and more material is showing up in a digital format, particularly unit histories, many of which you can access for free. For some, there is a modest fee to be able to access it. Now, if you write the National Personnel Record Center, I recommend that you write them at least 3 times. The first time, they will tell you that there was a fire. They won't necessarily say that the individual you're looking for records were destroyed. They will simply say there was a fire. It is true. On 12 July 1973, started what turned out to be a 4-day fire that destroyed some 16 to 18 million records of previous service members. They're not really sure precisely how many records were destroyed because large numbers of records had been pulled and shipped to the VA. So yes, there was a fire. Yes, there were a lot of records destroyed. However, many of those records have subsequently been reconstructed. This is why I say typically write 3 times. By the 3rd time, somebody will decide, okay, you're really serious about this, and will begin the process of providing you with information. I should point out that of great assistance, the National Personnel Records Center does have researchers for hire not on the staff, but as folks that appear frequently. These can be very helpful because they know Charlie who works there and can simply exchange pleasantries with Charlie and say, okay, I'm in today because I'm looking for these records for a patron. Anytime you can find that type of relationship, you're better off than just showing up cold or having your letter show up along with 500 others that day. And the individual saying, well, I can't possibly, I'll just tell them there was a fire, and if they write back, we'll worry about it then. Compiled service records. These are predominantly from the Civil War. They're generally provided by the National Archives in Washington. It is simply a piece of paper that is stuck inside an envelope that represents abstracts pulled from muster rolls, returns, pay vouchers, and other records. And so what you'll get will be the date mustered in, the various units the individual served in, if he was wounded or discharged because of illness or whatever. Pension records. Pension records can be very useful because oftentimes for individuals to get a pension, they must provide supporting documentation, birth certificates, marriage certificates, death certificates, etc. Keep in mind that until midway through the Civil War, there was no retirement per se. So if you were severely wounded or served a long time, it was pension records that you had to apply for in order to get any type of fiscal benefit. Oftentimes, widows are the ones that submitted documentation for pension records. Land bounties, or as I like to call them, bribes. Land bounties ended with the Mexican War. Land bounties were virtually a means to entice people to join during critical times by promising them plots of land out west. Look, we can't really pay you a bonus, but if you sign up and serve 3 years, we'll give you 180 acres in the Ohio Territory. So land bounties can be useful. The last time they were used was during the Mexican War. So you have a lot of research to do before you need worry about land bounties. State bonus records. In my case, until retirement, was a resident of the state of Iowa. Iowa offered Vietnam vets a $500 bonus. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending how you look at it, in order to obtain that bonus, you had to submit a tremendous amount of information and documentation proving that you were justified in receiving the bonus. Pennsylvania did the same thing with its various wars offering bonuses. The material is available at the state library in Harrisburg. Now, how can AHEC help? Unfortunately, at the moment, it is still closed and no indication when it will open up to researchers. But once it does, the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center has a tremendous number of published unit histories. Oftentimes, but not always, they will contain rosters of who served in that unit. If nothing else, it provides you an idea of what battles and campaigns a particular relative may have served in. Particularly with the Civil War, you may find that your Pennsylvania ancestors served at both Antietam or maybe Gettysburg. Useful information. The AHEC also has a large number of unit newsletters and magazines, extensive military history periodical collection, that oftentimes will help in determining where a unit was at a particular time, what battles it engaged in, etc. This is particularly true for Vietnam, where we didn't have front lines as such, but we would go by helicopter to a fire support base, set up for a few days, and then quickly move. It also has an extensive manuscript and photo collection, letters, diaries, and memoirs, reflections filled out by veterans. In fact, later today, I will be working through a letter collection provided by the executive director of the foundation pertaining to his father who served in World War II. These can be useful. Years ago, I was conducting an introduction to genealogy, followed by a trip to the reading room where individuals were allowed to do research. This one lady had never been able to track down, other than family lore, that an ancestor served in a particular machine gun battalion during World War I. I pulled 2 or 3 histories of machine gun battalions, put her in a corner and said, you'll just have to go through them, while I went to work with other patrons. We suddenly heard a scream as this lady discovered a photo of the ancestor she was looking for in the 4th Machine Gun Battalion, laying on the ground behind a machine gun. It was the first confirmation, if you will, that the ancestor had in fact served during World War II, World War I, and now had an image of him in uniform. Veteran survey, starting with the Spanish-American War, the MHI, a subset then of AHEC, began to do veteran surveys where we asked veterans to fill out questionnaires and, oh, by the way, include any letters, maps, or other documents that you would like. There are several thousand veteran surveys that are available. It's always worth checking to see if one of your ancestors took the time to fill out one of the veteran surveys. As mentioned earlier, we'll wrap up with questions. Again, if you think of questions after we've shut down, don't hesitate to forward them to the foundation. They will email them on to me. I remind you, I teach genealogy. I won't do your genealogy. I thank you for your time and attention and wish you well in your quest. At this time, may the force be with you, as my grandkids like to say, and we will now entertain questions.
Marty, right now we just only have one question. We might pick up more here. Someone asked if we could provide a list of all the organizations that you mentioned at the beginning of your talk. She wasn't able to write them down. I mean, he wasn't able to write them down as we went through them.
The easiest way would be to simply request a copy of the 8-page outline I used. They're all in that outline.
Okay.
If the individual doesn't want the outline, yes, they're easy to extract from the outline and can be provided as a separate document.
Very good. Any other questions? I guess either you have a bunch of listeners who've done this before and heard you before and asked all those questions in a previous time, or you answered most of the folks' questions. At this time, Marty, I'd like to thank you for presenting this today. For the listeners, it'll be posted eventually up on YouTube, probably in the next 3 or 4 days, so you can come back and hear it again. And we would ask you let your friends and associates know that this resource is available on YouTube for them to get at least an initial orientation that Marty provided today. So thanks again, Marty, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.